Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. Dr. Shavinsky, we can get started in just about a minute.
Okay, perfect.
Can you let me know if you're able to see the full screen?
I see the screen in presenter view, meaning I can see with the next slide. So I'm not sure if that's the one that you would want to have.
Yeah, I think I've fixed it now.
That's correct. Yes, that looks better.
Perfect. So let's just give it. I think we can go ahead and get started. The attendees has stabilized for now.
Okay, one moment.
And Jennifer, I think you're just far enough from the camera that it thinks you're part of the background, so you're just coming in and out of blurriness.
Let me try and open. I'm going to try and switch it to the main computer. Let me see if I can get that.
Not that I don't appreciate the interactiveness of it, by the way.
Let's see here. Okay. All right, I will work on that after, but I'll kick us off so that way we don't waste, miss time. But I'd like to welcome everybody to the Career Conversations Resume and Interview Tips session. You'll be hearing from, of course, Dr. Tzeng, who I will introduce in a moment, and I'm Dr. Jennifer Shavinsky, and I'll be facilitating. So if you can go to the next slide. We have no conflicts of interest to disclose for this presentation. For our agenda, we're going to be first talking through introductions, so introducing myself and Dr. Tzeng. Dr. Tzeng will then be carrying through to talk through interview tips. We then are very appreciative of those that submitted their resumes for review. And Dr. Tzeng will be going through some resume tips and that live resume review with real people's resumes who submitted theirs. So please keep in mind that this is for educational purposes to go through those different resumes. And then finally, we'll have a Q&A. Please, as you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. Dr. Tzeng will be answering questions throughout the session. So you don't have to feel like you have to keep all your questions to the end. Next slide. I'm, again, Dr. Jennifer Shavinsky. I'm the Deputy Public Health Officer with Riverside University Health System Public Health, which is the Riverside County Department of Public Health, where I oversee our Division of Infectious Disease, Community Health Planning, and Equity. And then I also serve as the Vice Chair for this upcoming ACPM conference, which I'm very excited to be able to do. Next slide, please. And this is just some information about the American College of Preventive Medicine, which represents more than 2,000 physicians in a variety of employment settings. And as you can see on the slide here, we have people that work in the health plan system, in private group practice, in university settings, industry, business. There's a variety of different settings, and Dr. Tzeng will be talking a little bit about how to prepare resumes for those different settings. Next slide. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the main speaker of this session. That would be Dr. Tzeng. Dr. Jeff Tzeng is a fellow of ACPM and has been an active member of the college throughout his career. He's boarded in preventive medicine, occupational medicine. He's held several senior leadership roles in both public and private sectors, including as Chief Medical Officer of Comcast NBC Universal and Chief Wellbeing Officer of AT&T. Currently, Dr. Tzeng leads a boutique healthcare consulting company offering expertise in healthcare strategy, health and well-being, and benefits. And Jeff lives in Los Angeles metro area with his wife and young son. So Dr. Tzeng comes to us with an incredible amount of experience, expertise, both in terms of the positions he's held, but also in terms of hiring individuals. And so he'll be sharing those expertise with you all here today. So I will pass it off to you, Dr. Tzeng, and I'll be monitoring the chat for any questions that may come up.
Great. Thank you so much for the warm introduction, and we'll just kick right off. So a couple of caveats. You asked 10 different people, resume and interview tips. You will get 10 different pieces of advice. So mine is just kind of from my own point of view, coming from industry. While we'll probably touch upon, and the stuff that I'll talk about will be generalizable for a whole host of public and private industry positions. My vantage point is more so from private company, meaning non-governmental. A lot of these will apply from that perspective. So I just want to give that one little caveat. So what I want to start off doing is talk briefly. So in my position previously as having chief medical officer, medical director roles, and chief wellbeing officers, I have seen a ton of resumes come through my desk, whether it's because we're hiring for contractors, which I've done many before, or I'm hiring for actual W-2 staff, all the way from entry level to senior staff from a clinician's point of view. And so my point of view is really about having been on that receiving side, looking at resumes, screening them, interviewing a ton, and then also from the point of view of having been on the interview side of it, meaning as a candidate for multiple various positions. So that's my perspective, and I want to highlight some of the things as I've had residents come through, rotate with me over the course of the last 5 to 10 years, some of the common things that people have questions about, and hopefully we'll be able to tackle those. And as Dr. Shivishi said before, if you have questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat box, and we'll get to it as we hit this session. So I want to talk briefly about the stages of interviews. And so this may be old news for some, it may be new news for others. So we're going to zoom out and look at the broad perspective from beginning to end. So obviously you see a job posting, you get reached out to by a recruiter. We'll talk about the recruiting in a second. A resume lands at someone's desk. Usually it's a talent acquisition, TA as they normally are called, or someone in the HR field that also does talent acquisition, and or the hiring manager. The hiring manager is a term that you should learn and internalize. Hiring manager is basically the person. The hiring manager is basically the person who will decide if you will get hired or not. Often it's the boss, meaning your boss, but it's not always the case. Generally it's the case, but not always the case. So just want to keep that in mind. So typically the first stage is a screening resume that does not require you talking to anyone. It's literally your resume has landed digitally, so to speak, in front of someone's desk, and they're screening basically en masse a bunch of CVs and resumes. That is kind of hurdle number one. How do you get your resume seen and selected for a follow-on conversation? That's kind of hurdle number one. So that's a screening resume, usually by talent acquisition or someone in the HR field. It sometimes does involve the hiring manager, particularly if it's for a clinician role that is unique. So for example, when I was chief medical officer at 2 non-healthcare companies, and I was looking for clinical staff, PM, OM, or otherwise, the talent acquisition team really hadn't hired a bunch of those before, so they really didn't know quite what to look for. So I was really involved with the front end of it to say, these are the kinds of profiles we're looking for. These are the kinds of profiles we're not really quite looking for. So they get a sense of it. So once screening happens, again, screening is you're sitting there, you don't even know if your resume is ever being looked at. If you've been selected past the screening piece, you'll get a screening call. The screening call is usually from someone in a talent acquisition or HR space. It'll be a phone call, maybe a video call, and they just want to get to know you a little bit. They want to go over the general gist of the role, potentially the reporting structure, the background of the role, how it came to be. Usually, sometimes they go over also salary expectations and things like that. I'll take a little caveat. We're not going to dive deep into the salary piece unless you guys are interested in, but sometimes they go over that because they want to know whether or not they can afford you, number one, or if we're even in the right zone of salary space. So what happens sometimes is a job will look super interesting and you get it and you're like, man, the salary is really low, or you get it and your expectation is a huge mismatch from what the company is offering. They want to know that kind of upfront. If you're expecting double what they can reasonably pay, a company really doesn't want to go through 5, 6, 7, 10 rounds of interviews, then to find out that we were so off. And I'm not talking a few thousand, I'm talking we're off by hundreds of $1,000s that a company is unwilling to pay for, or there's a mismatch there. The company doesn't want to know that 2 months into the interview process. So usually those things will come up fairly early in terms of that. In terms of that. Now, once you pass the screening interview, again, the screening interview is typically not the hiring manager. It's an HR person that wants to kind of check the box. Okay, I verified that the person is they were a normal person. They were articulative. They were able to explain their background a little bit. I had a better understanding of them. Hey, this is a person you probably want to talk to, Mr. Hiring or Mrs. Hiring Manager. And then you get to the hiring manager phase, which is kind of the first, usually, of several interviews. The hiring manager, particularly in large companies, they have ultimately the last say in it, but they usually go with what everyone else likes as well. They're generally closely aligned. My term would be fairly rare that a hiring manager would pick the dark horse candidate that no one likes unless there's something particularly special about them. The reason being is the hiring manager also has to support a bunch of other staff that works with them. And if everyone is in agreement on the candidate, there's a good chance that they'll be supported through the interview process and during onboarding. And so the hiring manager is really important, but everyone else is also really important in the decision-making process as well. The number of interviews that you'll go through will vary broadly. Generally speaking, the more senior the role, the more people you will meet, the more people you have interview with. I think that is expected. What I would say is if you're interviewing for a role and the first and only call you get is all the interview, that's fairly rare. It could be that role is not as competitive as you might think, and it's a volume game. They're just trying to get a bunch of people. Not say that that's a bad thing. It's just you kind of want to understand that piece. And on the other spectrum, for a really senior role, particularly those that are not posted, they may have a ton of interviews. Dozen or more is not uncommon. I can tell you in the last two senior corporate roles that I had, again, non-clinical roles, as a clinician entering a non-clinical senior leadership role, I had dozen and a half interviews, and that was not uncommon. And these interviews are based off of their timing schedule, not your timing schedule. So I want to say that especially if you're interviewing for mid to senior career track industry type of roles, it's pretty rare that you'll have something from beginning to end all wrapped up in a bow with an offer letter within a month. These can take many, many months, even when all the stars are aligned. You always have a holiday coming up. You always have end of a quarter with a fiscal thing. And even before you get to offer, finance and HR have to sign off on it, which means they have to reconsolidate to make sure, hey, do we actually have the money to afford a new doctor? All these things happen and can slow down the process. So I only call that out, that if particularly for applying for industry roles, it's May or late May. If you're applying for a role now, hoping that you're going to start in a month, probably not a realistic expectation. So that's just really important. And the more senior the role, the longer this interview journey takes, because it's really just kind of a leisurely stroll down the beach with a bunch of stakeholders, and they want to get to know you and take a beat and things like that. And so that's just to give you a little frame of reference that senior roles take a long time to go through. It's a bit of a war on attrition and patience, But if you make it to the end, it's often very, very fruitful. So once you get through all the different interviews, you're likely going to meet a bunch of people that you're like, oh, I totally understand why I'm meeting them. And you're also going to meet people I don't really fully understand why I'm meeting these people. Different companies do it different ways, but generally you can bucket two categories of people. You're going to interview people that you would work with, work for. You don't typically interview with people that would work for you. So I want to say that again. It's pretty rare. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's fairly rare that you're sitting across the interview table, physical or virtual otherwise, and that person will end up being your direct report right off the bat. Maybe eventually becomes that case, but it's pretty rare for that to happen because the person in front of you may also have been applying for that role or interested in that role. And so you want to keep that in mind. So the people that you're meeting have a vantage point of, think about it as peer and above point of view from the organization, not necessarily your level and below. And that's an important caveat to think about. Then the other bucket, you're going to meet people that are within the business typically, that don't necessarily work with you all the time, but they have a cultural obligation to the company to continue to keep the culture of the company strong and moving along, and their input is to say, oh, this person really fits the temperature and the mission of the company. So that does happen. Again, it varies widely, but the more senior the role, the more people you meet that you may or may not actually ever work with, but they're really say, oh, this person's DNA is really fits this company well. And they often have influence as well as all the other people. So I just want to call that out. Now, once you get through all the interview stages, typically there's an offer that happens. Now, different companies do it different ways. We won't spend too much time on this, but essentially you kind of get the pre-offer as you're getting towards the end. A really good talent acquisition team will be their tour guide along the way, their tour guide. And as you get close to the final destination scene or however you want to call it, they're dialing in on, hey, I want to circle back to some of the great parts of this role. Here's all the benefits, the PTO, time off. Here's your 401k matching, stocks, all those things like that. Here's the general gist of the salary. They want to calibrate that. In the off chance that the team likes you and want to give you an offer, they want to wait until the team is ready to go before they tie up all the end. That's also a time where they're saying, hey, do you have a timeline that you're working with? Oh, yes, actually, I just gave birth and I'm actually going to have to be out of pocket for X amount of time. Or actually, I just finished one job. Actually, I'm going to move to other, part of the world. Here's my things that I'm working about. Or it could be, actually, I'm actually interviewing a couple other places. Here's the timing of it. I'm going to land pretty soon on the offer on this one. How are we looking at a timeline for the job I'm currently interviewing for? That's also really, really common. And so you shouldn't be too shy on articulating some of those things. Articulating it and being needy are two different things, but there's a fine line. I just want to call that out. Having some self-restraint and insight is important, but TAs commonly have to deal with these timeline pressures. And so them knowing that is often sometimes helpful. So again, you get the pre-offer stage where they're really calibrating if things are going to land and go forward. Then usually you get to a verbal offer stage. So in this case, someone will call me and say, hey, Dr. So-and-so, congratulations. Typically a hiring manager, doesn't always have to be, but usually it is. Congratulations. Grab a pen and paper. Here's actually the details of the offer. You'll write it down. And then it is your opportunity to react a little bit. In rare circumstances, you say yes right on that call. You need to actually take a beat, thank them and say, I'm really excited. I just need to take a moment to digest this. Then you actually take it down and digest it. And then you'll respond via email or otherwise with any concerns or counters that you have. When all that's kind of done, then you usually get a final offer letter or a version of offer letter, and it details a lot of different things: your salary, when your start date is going to be, who your hiring manager is going to be, the title of it, all those things happen. And you want to really look through that carefully. It may or may not include things related to non-competes. So we won't talk about those. A lot of important details are in that. You really, really want to read that. Don't be overly clouded by the fact that that you've landed an industry job and you're so excited and you can't wait to sign that dotted line. It will likely end up happening that you'll sign a dotted line, but you want to make sure you totally understand what you're getting yourself into before you do that. Then you sign a dotted line. There may or may not be, drug testing. Background testing is almost always the case, particularly for senior level jobs. They want to know, have you had a legal action against you that's pending, malpractice? All those things are really, they tease that through. Once that's done, then you'll be cleared to kind of them accepting everything, and then you have a start date. The only reason I call this out is the timing can be tricky. Just because you get an offer letter and you sign it doesn't actually mean you're going to start the job. It almost always does, but it doesn't always mean that. Let's say you do that and they find out, one thing on your background that you didn't disclose that you didn't think was a big deal, and it's a big deal for them, and then the background check doesn't go through. Again, I've never seen that happen for the roles that I've seen before, but I've heard of those things happening for other non-clinical roles. Is all of a sudden, they uncover something in the background, and then they rescind the offer. Really rare that an offer gets rescinded, but it does happen. It has happened before. I just want to call that out. You don't really reach the finish line until you're actually in onboarding on orientation, that first stage. Just want to call that. I don't want to scare people, by the way, but really, you won't really start until you started that first day and that ID is warm. That's when you've made it to the other side from that perspective. So that's the stages of the interview. And then let's talk a little bit about the prepping for interview. So again, you have questions or thoughts, go ahead and pop them in there. If not, we'll just keep on
That is
rolling.
a good segue. We do have one question that rolled in.
Oh yeah, let's do it.
See if that makes sense for speaking about now, or if you have a separate section on it. Before I read that question, I'll say, working in government, it's pretty similar in terms of timelines, that you can't expect that, you're going to apply and then all of a sudden you have a job in a month. It also takes multiple months. And similarly, like oftentimes you'll have that offer letter and then they'll still be doing the background check and all of those things afterwards. So a lot of parallels there that I've experienced too. The question that has come in is, do you recommend retaining legal counsel for contract review when applying for industry mid to senior level positions?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I would say, the more senior the level, it makes sense to do that. And let me just give you like my frame of reference. So there's big picture forest and tree view. So let's talk about big picture forest. If you're a senior level clinician in a non-clinical role, industry type of role, you're very likely making a few hundred to several hundred, if not more, $1,000 a year. So let's just even take a number of like $250,000 a year from an industry role, which is kind of maybe right in the middle. There's going to be some above, there's going to be some below, but like that's a neutral number. A contract review may cost you a few $1,000s. So for 1% of one annual base salary, give or take, you'll at least have the lawyer say, hey, look, here's like the 4 things based off of your concerns that might get you, and maybe they're all non-compete related or whatever. They're actually, this is pretty standard stuff. These things, I wouldn't even worry about it. Totally unenforceable. Hey, this is really unique. I've never seen this in there. It says that you can't ever work in any of the states that they have business in. They're in 50 states. What are you going to do? And it looks like it's pretty hardcore contract. A few $1,000s, a single digit percentage of your base salary seems like a pretty reasonable way to go about that, and allows you to understand what the give and takes are for these roles. Now, I'm not going to make any comments about the FCC non-compete, things like that. That may totally upend some of the things that we end up doing. But do take some time to review it. Again, not suggesting you have to do it, but the more senior the role, the more money's at stake, so to speak. It may be advisable to get a second set of eyes to take a look at it and you articulate what your concerns are. Am I solely worried about the money? Explain to me how the stock options work and stuff like that. Actually, I'm really worried about, I'm going to go in, I'm going to do a few years, I'm going to use this as a jumping off board for something else in the industry. Well, you want to be really honed in on non-compete because you think you're going to knock out 2 years at it and then move to competitor. They may have something to say against that. So just keep that in mind.
There is one other question that comes
Yeah.
through. This is a good pause point. So we just got a question about mid-senior level. We now have one more towards the earlier
Yeah.
end of the career spectrum. The question comes through of how soon do you suggest looking for a first job after residency? This person is offering that they've heard 12 months, maybe 6 months before you want to start working. And they want to know, is that consistent with what you've experienced in terms of the timeline? When should they start looking as they're finishing up residency?
Yeah, so I say very widely, 12 months is fairly early. So think about it from my point of view. So if I'm a hiring manager, in any of those I've had before, I'm gonna get an applicant, I'm gonna fall in love with you, anonymous attendee, that's the name. So anonymous attendee, I'm gonna fall in love with you and your resume. And then what's gonna happen? I want to work here, but hold on, can you wait 12 months until I graduate and do whatever? No one's gonna wait 12 months. 12 months, a lot of things will happen. It's not because of you, it's because of us. 12 months, I'm going to pass through several fiscal quarters, a fiscal year, very likely. That's budgeting. I may have already budgeted that I'm going to spend X amount of dollars for this new headcount. Now I'm going to say, well, I can hold for 12 months or 8 months or 9 months for this role. Then finance is going to say, well, you didn't really need it if you can hold for 9 months without this role. So I would say 12 months is on the longer end. Now, that doesn't mean you're not kicking around the tires, right? You don't just show up to a car showroom and just decide you want to buy a car right on the spot. You're probably doing some research, getting a sense of what kind of roles you want. That can happen as early as you want to happen. Getting a sense of what it is you want to do, networking, that can happen way, way before. That needs to happen actually way, way before you want to decide on what jobs to interview for. Then when you're getting into the 8, 7, 6 month range, your CV resume needs to already be pretty teed up. You already have been thinking about what your story is going to be, what your storyline is going to be, and they can start applying for jobs because it's 6 months, a couple of months to go through your interview. I'm holding out a few months for your start date. That's not unreasonable. But talent acquisition don't want to interview you and then say, I've got to wait 9 months for you to start or wait a year before non-compete expires. It's hard to imagine people will wait for that unless it's the most senior job, which sometimes they do. But for these entry early career type of jobs, 12 months is on the earlier side in terms of actually submitting applications for roles. 6, 7, 8 months, probably a good sweet spot.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna so keep those questions coming to the extent they're helpful. They may not be helpful, so if not, we'll know pretty quickly. So we're gonna talk about how to prep for interviews. So reminder, we're gonna do the screening call. Now you have your first set of meetings with the hiring manager and then on. You're gonna hear this a lot of other people say this, but we say it because it's true. You want to be yourself. And I say this, people know that that's like rule number one is to let your personality shine. But in the hundreds of people I've interviewed before, a common mistake is that they're just so rehearsed that I can't really tell who they are, that they're just kind of like, a robot coming in, interviewing, and the answers are great, but I leave going myself, I don't know. The interview was uninspiring because I really couldn't get a sense of them. And I use this term. I use it with my residents when they rotate with me, and I do this kind of workshop with them. The airport test. So if I'm on an airport and I'm on a layover and I got delayed, I'm having to spend 3, 4, 5 hours with you at the airport. Am I going to enjoy my company with you? Am I going to try to avoid you, or are you going to drive me crazy? Believe it or not, a lot of us do some version of this. Interview for someone isn't just about the technical ability, how smart someone is. That's really important. Don't get me wrong. But interview for someone that you're going to work with and someone's going to work for you. If they drive you crazy, you're not going to want to be around them no matter how smart they are, right? And so keep that in mind, that you want your own personality, to shine through. And if there's no chemistry there, there's no chemistry there. You can't force function these relationships to happen. With that being said, maybe in medical school or residency or even professional coaches, they do things like personality assessments and things like that. And so if you know that you over-index on a couple of things and you have the self-insight, someone's like, hey, maybe take that little piece of your personality, aggressiveness down a notch. Do keep that in mind because that comes through over-indexed in interviews. They're going to remember that. Remember, they don't spend the before and after the interview. They spend that 30, 40, 50 minutes with you on an interview. That's all that they remember. A sheet of paper, you on an interview, virtual, in person, otherwise, and it's that time period and that's it. And so 100% of their recollection of you is purely based on interaction. So really, really think about that and the impact of that. Know your positive and negatives. And I say this because, and I'm not saying this because like someone will ask you like, you know, what are your strengths and weaknesses? That may happen. You know, be prepared to answer however you want to answer on those. There's no, you know, there's a lot of wrong ways to answer it. You know, there's no particular right way to answer it. So just answer how you do it on that one. But what I mean is that the things that may be a distractor, whether it's in a resume, maybe there's a gap in a work history, maybe there is, I don't know, a repeat board test you had to do or something that kind of makes your story non-linear. Be prepared to answer that directly, concisely, accurately, and then be done with it. The ones that always give me red flags were I saw a gap. A gap is not a showstopper, by the way, but I saw a gap and I'm asking, hey, explain to me why there was a 1 year gap here. Or maybe I'm not understanding the resume enough. And then there's like this circuitous like answer that to me sounds like you're trying to hide something. I'm not saying that's the case, but to me it sounds like, man, you spent like a lot of time over this. This could have been, you know, I took a break from this year to this year of residency. I traveled the world, took care of my family. That's a really good answer. Done. We move on. But instead, if you take this 5 minutes like circuitous answer and then you don't even stick the landing, I'm going, oh, there's something more there. Remember, I only have 45 minutes to an hour with you. And then you're going to spend 10, 20% of that time talking about this non-linear answer. That doesn't work particularly well in your favor. So any potential negatives, negative in quotation here that you might have going in, you're going to know them well before they do. Be prepared. What is your answer going to be? Rehearse a couple of different versions, you know, and figure out which feels more comfortable for you to answer them, so you can answer them directly to the extent you can, and then move on with it. Okay, yeah. This advice that I'm going to give is going to be cringe-worthy for a lot of people when you practice it, but it is the single most important thing in terms of an interview thing that someone ever gave to me in terms of public speaking and stuff. How you present yourself is really, really important. And so, yes, we're all nodding that's the case. And so we take that one step further. When you're interviewing in person or via video, remember, this is all that we get to see of you. No matter how well you rehearse by reading your resume, you know, I'm reading, I'm practicing ahead of it. This does not replace. I'm actually recording myself and then watching myself later practice an interview, even as simple as, Dr. Jeff, tell me a little bit about yourself. You'll be so surprised out of the hundreds of people I've interviewed, how easy someone stumbles across that one versus a well-rehearsed because someone's watched themselves do it and go, oh man, I really like stutter a lot, or, you know, or I get myself caught up on these things. I use a lot of things like that. Recording yourself practice your introductions, recording yourself practice different versions of answers, and then watching yourself is super painful. I learned so much about how I present that's paid itself dividend. And why is that particularly important? If I'm interviewing you in a high stakes but a one-on-one scenario, and this is a mid to senior role, these roles, I expect this doctor, you, to be talking to other stakeholders who are non-clinical. If you can't explain without jumbling a bunch of words or without over-indexing on your expertise, without explaining something simply, to me as another clinician, how can I expect to put you in front of a meeting with other non-clinicians and be effective in that way? So those are the things that I think about, the other senior leaders think about when they're hiring. Can this person represent the company? Can they represent my department? Can they represent our interest and what we want to do? And so again, to kind of summarize this piece here, practicing and knowing your resume is really important. One step further, this is like for the gunners and the A pluses in the group, record yourself, play that back. You're gonna cringe yourself looking at it, but do that over and over and over again. You're gonna be well practiced, well rehearsed. You'll be shocked that little thing will separate you from the pack dramatically so. Dramatically so. You think people when they present, you look at some of the best presenters, whether it's YouTube or other places, and they talk and it seems so conversational. They didn't just wake up and like was a natural speaker. They rehearsed it so much, their introduction, their landing points, they rehearse it so much that it becomes conversational. That's why it sounds natural. If you do that during the interview, afterwards, what will happen when they debrief with the team, this person was so well presented. Executive presence is the word that they use. That is a differentiating factor. A person who's super smart but doesn't present well, a person who's average at best but presents really well, this candidate, at least from my perspective, from an industry side, will win like 99.9% of the time. So that part takes practice and everyone can get better at it. So again, at the risk of being over-indexed on that one, that's super, super important.
Can I ask you a question as you're talking about interview skills? We don't have one coming in, but one that I see some people have challenge with sometimes and wondering maybe you can help provide some insight on. In some of the interviews that I've conducted, I've noticed some people might have challenges with understanding or recognizing how long they should talk for. So interview, there may be 5 questions. How do you suggest people that are going on interviews budget their time or understand how long they should spend on a specific topic versus another topic?
Yeah. So I'll answer a couple of different thoughts. Screening call from a talent acquisition, whatever, your sole goal on that screening call is to get past that gatekeeper. So you want to dump that you're a pretty reasonable, nice person, that you're smart, you're well qualified for the role. And then you got to then get them to say yes to it. These screening calls take like 10, 15 minutes. Then the first hiring manager call that you get, which is usually after screening, that one can be anywhere from 30 minutes to 45 minutes or so. The reason that usually is in there by the hiring manager is I don't want a candidate go through the interview loop and go through a dozen, and then I finally meet this person. I'm like, oh yeah, this person's a dud. We just wasted 12, 13 hours of interview time just to get to there. So right after screening, I usually interview them really quickly. Pretty reasonable first impression. Okay, let's put them through the gauntlet. Each of those typically are anywhere between 30 minutes to an hour. It just varies. It's pretty rare that you'll have an interview last more than an hour. The times that when they do happen is when you get invited. These are more mid to senior level roles. You get invited on site, an exploration day or two. I've had many of those where they'll come in, bring your family in, and you get interviewed for a day or two, and then you spend through the weekend, have some dinner with some people. Every single second you're on the clock, dude. Every single second. So don't let your armor down. That's why being yourself is really important, because if you are yourself, you never have to be on. You are who you are. They like you or they don't like you from that perspective. But in terms of conciseness of it, I would say for the kinds of questions you expect to have, be ready for 2 versions to talk about. One is a more shorter, concise version that then if there's time that they want to follow on for it, you have another layer or 2 of depth that you didn't have to do. But that kind of think about it as like the abstract of the research needs to encapsulate the gist of it, but it needs to include all the important pieces. Don't hold anything back there. And then if the interview wants to follow on, because every interview is different. Some interviewers want to go super deep down one topic until you're like, oh my gosh, this is enough. Some interviews just want to touch the top, but they won't go super broad on a bunch of random things. Some never hit any of it. They just want to talk about other ancillary stuff because you just want to know if they can hang out with you. So be prepared for a whole bunch of different varieties. You will never be able to predict whether the interviews are going to be depth, breadth, or something completely ancillary. So you want to be ready for different variations of that. With that being said, it's actually a really good pivot point when I talk about some of the other interview tips, which is be prepared to talk about your skills and accomplishments in two different points of views. So one is what I consider a very linear way of saying, here's what I accomplished, A, B, C, D, and here's the metrics and all this. Like you're kind of listing your skills and accomplishments. That's a super effective way to do it. Be prepared to do that, although rarely you'll be asked in such a kind of, frontal attack point of view. Usually it's tell me about a time about this. And so you want to be prepared to talk about your accomplishments in a story form. So remember, I talked about how you present on yourself, interviewing as if you're telling a story. Again, in my opinion, for senior level roles are really, really important because effective leaders are effective communicators. And effective communicators are storytellers. Again, I'm not saying you're going to give some kind of long prose or anything like that. I'm not saying that you need to do that or have script writers, but you need to be able to articulate, oh, this one time, maybe something like, tell me a time you had a really difficult patient, right? So the gist of it isn't about whether or not you've had a difficult patient. That's not the gist of the question. The gist is, well, I want to know how you interact with different people because we work with a bunch of different stakeholders. I can't have you like going off on one of our patients, clients, or support staff, things like that. And so, you can say, well, I really believe in teamwork and open communication and stuff like that. Well, that's really great. That's really straightforward. But a level deeper on sophistication, how you interview for those kinds of questions would be, that's a really great question. I remember this one time, I was a few years out of residency and I had my first kind of real challenging patient. This was an individual that came in and was really asking for a bunch of different medicines and things like that that were kind of not clinically indicated. And here's how I got him to the other side in terms of how to get the right treatment based off of evidence research, but without having you felt like you're gypped on the things that you came in originally thinking that you needed. So imagine that story going through. Now, instead of having the person kind of articulate the list of stuff he told them, they just remember, I don't remember all the details, but I remember he told this really cool story related to a difficult patient and how they were not aligned, but at the end of it, they were aligned. Those are much more memorable than someone listing 5 different things, but be prepared to do both. That takes a lot of practice. Very few people are just born to storytell from that perspective. So that's why practicing is really, really important from that perspective. A couple other interview tips as it relates to that, and we'll get right into a quick minute on the recruiters, and we'll get to the CVs. I was gonna say this goes without saying, but out of all the interviews I've done, these stand out to me as like not particularly great ones. Be mindful of the background that you have for your interviews, particularly if they're virtual. Don't do them on your bed. Yes, I've had that happen before. Be dressed up reasonably. Yes, you may be interviewing from home, but that doesn't mean that you should be in your pajamas and, some rock metal t-shirt, unless, you happen to be interviewing for a, musical company or things like that. Yes, that has happened before, and it's really, really strange. It's almost surreal. I can't even concentrate as an interviewer, let alone in those circumstances. So be prepared to think about that one. Your audio check, like, oh, I'm still trying to figure out how to use the audio. That just really doesn't fly anymore in this day and age. And so, if you're OCD-ish like me, you're gonna double check your framing, your lighting, everything like that days before. You're gonna check the day before. You're gonna check the morning of before you get there, because nothing will zap what would otherwise be a friendly, easy interview. That I've been stumbling through the tech and I gotta call you back, and now the person's like, man, I was hoping to take a look at you. Now I'm just talking on the phone. No bueno, no bueno, okay? A quick moment on recruiters, and then we'll get ready for the resumes. Generally speaking, there are 2 kinds of recruiters, or 2 buckets of thoughts. There are internal recruiters, meaning the recruiters, talent acquisition people work for the company themselves. They'll reach out directly. And they're external, meaning either the company has hired them or they just happen to be a recruiting agency finding talent and introducing them to it. So there's internal and external, okay? And then the part that I really want to land with you guys, there are two types of recruiting buckets. There are contingent and there are retained. There may be different words, but essentially contingent is, as a recruiter, I only get paid if I match someone, and a company can have a bunch of different recruiters, and whoever matches it will get paid for it. They are not necessarily to your interest, because once you sign up with a recruiter, that recruiter owns your resume for the purposes of this company. And if they don't have the right in for the company, you're just kind of locked and stuck with it, not particularly great. And then the retained ones are a company will pay a recruiting firm. These happen at the senior levels, an X amount of dollars. Whether we fill it or not, whoever fills it, that company gets paid. Usually those are kept for the more senior roles. So just keep that in mind. Thinking about the benefits of the recruiting is really, really important. So if a company has a job posting, you're usually okay just applying directly to it. I'm rarely seeing a circumstance where going through a recruiter into a job that's publicly posted, unless they're exclusively retained for it, is a huge benefit for you. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes left. Let's go ahead. Again, feel free to drop questions there. Let's go ahead. We have 3 resumes. As we're pulling that up, just a couple of caveats. These are for educational purposes. I want to thank the 3 physicians who submitted their resume. My point of view is from the industry point of view, not necessarily from governmental and things like that. And so the way I'm going to react to it, we've skimmed it to take out kind of personal details like phone number or home address and things like that. The way I'm going to skim through it is I'm going to react to it in the way that I would look at it if I'm screening for resumes. You will be surprised, and Dr. Chemesky may not agree with me, or maybe does. People think that a person's going to look at a candidate's resume and spend minutes and hours on it. We do not. We spend minutes, max, singular minutes on it during the screening process, and we'll skim it again, maybe before the interview, and we might take one more kind of closer look again. But the idea that we're going to spend 10, 20 minutes on our resume before we head into an interview or a screening call, that's not the case. So a resume is super important, but keep that in mind. We're spending seconds on it, so high yield is important. Okay. So
and for the record, I don't disagree. Nobody has time for that. Nobody's spending half an hour on a resume.
Yeah, because
you're getting 10 different people that you might be interviewing.
100%.
Look.
Okay. So just a couple of things in there. The name is up there. I would just throw in that it's MD or DO on there, plus or minus the MPH. For me, if I see this, you're gonna make me scroll to the bottom for me to realize you're a physician. You may not even get to that point. I might be like, I don't have time for that, right? Because you'll be surprised. A job posting will say a clinical role for a physician. You will be so surprised how many people apply that are not doctors. It happens so often, just so often. So if your strong point is being an MD or DO, so Dr. Brent, I would add that in there, especially if MPH. Dayton, Ohio, that's perfectly fine. I've gotten to a point where I just have my phone number, my email, my LinkedIn, my name, and my degree. I don't have my address in there anymore. I don't have where I'm from, because people, they shouldn't, but people make all kinds of judgments about where you're from. In this day and age with the global workforce, you really don't need to have your address and stuff like that in there necessarily, particularly if you're applying for a role that is not in your local area. You don't want someone to say, Dayton, Ohio, well, this guy would never move to California. I'm based in California. This guy's never going to move to California for X, Y, and Z reason. But what's not in there is maybe, Brett, you're actually from Southern California. You're waiting to come back. None of that ever happens. So if that's gone, I just think, okay, well, Brett is Brett. Okay. So summary of qualifications, I like that. I like a little bit on top. It just gives me the bottom line up front. So something like that is pretty reasonable. You have 4 kind of solid lines there. I wouldn't go any more than that. Any more than that, it's a lot of reading. And again, as Jennifer mentioned, for every one non-clinical job, I'm getting hundreds of resume. I'm screening through a ton. I ain't got time to read through close the 100 resumes. Okay, so work experience, a couple of reactions. I think that partial remote, the parenthetical is not necessary. It doesn't give anything from me, and it can only add to controversy if this role is hybrid. First thing I want to think about, I'm going to write my notes for other people to follow up on. Are you expecting remote work or whatever it is? So for me, that only introduces issues in there. So for the purposes of an industry one, I would strike that from there. And then again, when I look at it, next I'm looking at the chronology. So I'm going back in time. You've been in this role for 4 years. The next role, you've been at that for a couple of years. I'm looking for gaps. That's how I look at it. I'm not saying other people will, but I'm looking for gaps because if there's a gap, I want to know what the gap is about. So you're following chronology. Let's keep on scrolling down and I'll go back, do it one more time. So 15, and then, okay, go and keep on the second page for me here, actually. So I want to talk about one thing. The education and training. So you ask 10 different people, you're going to get 10 different pieces of advice. I think the strongest selling point that you have as a physician is that you're a physician that's completed training. That's why I personally like to see someone's, doctorate, master's, all those things at the very top, because boom, you have your strongest point at the very top. Where you have it is perfectly fine because I'm going to get to it. It's only 2 pages, not a big deal. But my resume is set up where I have my education on top because that's, in fact, my strongest selling point is not that my last job. My strongest was I'm actually a clinician. So if that's the thing you're looking for, I'm addressing that way up top. Again, Brett, not suggesting you need to change your strategy, but just want to talk about that. And then the skills piece is all pretty reasonable. What I would say is that you're going to get to a point in a couple of years from now where you won't have enough space. You're going to figure out what to prioritize in there. And you may have to get to a point where your additional activities, skills, and education need to be merged in a way that they're not 3 distinct different things. You're going to have a spacing issue. My guess is the next couple of years. I'm going to scroll to the top here again. So here's what I like about what you have so far. You have clearly in the percentages and things like that. So that articulates to me, you're able to talk about the achievements that you've had. Just make sure, though, that what you wrote in there, when you go to an interview, you're able to talk about every dimension of that bullet point you have in there, top to bottom, in full depth. Nothing is more of a turnoff for me that I see someone articulating achievement and I ask them about it, and they verbally talk about in an interview in a way that lets me believe they didn't really do the work. That is the biggest turnoff. I see that all the time because people want to hyperinflate, understandably so, some of their accomplishments. But if you're not able to talk about those accomplishments in a really detailed way that lets me know you actually did the work, it will be a huge turnoff for them. Otherwise, start thinking about there's a lot of blocks of words in there. But you have action verbs. Those are all really great. I think there's a lot of text in there to read. So from a reading perspective, there's a little bit of fatigue that can set in. Not if you're the first resume, but if you're the 5th, 10th, 20th resume of the day, there's gonna be a lot of reading in there. So start thinking about, could you remove some extra words and some extra adjectives but still highlight what you want to do in there. And the last thing, we'll move on to the next one, will be for those that have federal in the government, in the veteran. So first of all, thank you for your service, Dr. Brett. It is, I haven't seen it in here, but it's common that you'll use military nomenclature to articulate something. And if your hiring person understands it, it's not a big deal. If they don't understand it, they're going to be totally lost by your resume. That is not the case here. But if you are a listener, watcher, and you're from a military background, be hyper acute that you're not using military or government acronyms, industry acronyms in your resume. Okay, let's go move to the next one here.
As you switch to the next one, just one question that came through. Do you recommend including dates on the CV? So it says, I'm 37 and worried about age-related discrimination, so I generally leave my medical school graduation date off. Yeah.
I would say at 37, you're not quite at the age where I'd be worried about age discrimination. So I am many years older than you, and I still have my my graduation dates on. I have seen it. You can certainly leave it off. I would say you may not be at a point where I would be particularly worried about the age piece of it. I've seen it both ways. What I would say is if you leave it off and someone's attuned about the timeline of your work history, you may have them to do, you may make them do more work than what is necessary. It's not a huge thing if you leave it off, I'm being honest with you. But the question is, if by leaving too much off, you're making the reader do so much work to piece together the puzzle that it becomes exhausting for them. That's the only concern I would have. But that's not a particularly great answer for you. But most of them that I see, I would say 99% of the resumes I see have dates on them, even if they're from a while ago.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if this person means age discrimination which way. Like if they're applying for a more senior job, somebody sees they're 37, they're not, in
Oh,
their
I see.
50s
Oh,
or,
yeah.
or the other, yeah. So I'm not sure which direction they meant it.
Oh, yeah.
But I also say typically I see the dates too on yeah.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, now that you read it this way, if you're worried that you're going to be seen as too junior for a senior role, the medical school date is going to be what does you in. It's your work history is going to be what does you in on that one, if that makes sense, right? Because if we're looking for a 15-year work history and you don't have 15 years, there's nothing you can do to make 15 years pop out of there. With that being said, the years are just a recommendation. So if you don't hit around on that, don't be worried about applying for it. Just be worried about over-indexing on your experience to make up for it. Okay, here's this next one. So Dr. Unrow, really great. Again, we don't need, oh yeah, I've seen resumes with date of births and social security numbers and marital status. Cut all that out. I've seen them with pictures. The only few times that pictures and resumes work are if you're in a country that typically is common. So Middle East, I've seen them a lot. In Asian countries, it's very common to have pictures as part of it. And then if you're doing media related, front of camera related stuff, let's presume that's not what we're talking about here. So picture is not necessary. Again, summary is perfectly good. Core qualifications, there's a lot in there. And the question I would have is, difference between summary and the core qualifications. So core qualifications, could you do that in a way that has less words? And so you're just listing bullet point wise the key things you want to land, free up some additional space so that you can go into more detail on your experience. Because by the time I read through the core qualifications, it may be all that I read, and that's perfectly fine. But that's like a dozen bullet points in there. It's quite a few. And from a screening point of view, there's a lot written in there. Okay, let's go to the professional experience. Okay, so here's one thing I want to say. So we are a resident. Okay, 2022 to present. And I see a 2022 to 23 on the bottom of it. I already have questions related to timeline. So are we doing it by chronology? Are we not? I see a bunch of to presents. And so you'll want to be able to wrap up in your screening call. What is your timeline? Because I see a bunch of things to present, then I see a 22 to 23. So if you're a resident, are these other stuff not resident, or are they a part of your residency? Did you do another residency and you came back later to do a second one? Those are the things that I'd be thinking about, how the timeline works in there. And if you are currently a resident, which it looks like you are the case here, here's the one thing, just food for thought. Please don't use this as, the definitive Bible for you to change anything. Is I have like 15 years of work experience. My resume is 2 pages, actually 2.5 pages. And I've seen people that have 20, 30 years of work experience and they cram it into 2.5, 3 pages max. Not a CV industry resume. CV needs to be really long because of all your research and stuff like that. So when I see early careerist resident, for example, and I have a 3 or 4 page resume, that's a lot of stuff in there for resume for me to digest. I'm not suggesting you go with a half pager. I'm not suggesting it at all. I would try your best to go into 2 pages there, mostly because how much of some of those stuff is really vital for the brevity of what you're writing for. Just keep that in mind a little bit there. on this, scroll down to the last page here for me. Certifications and licensing. Yeah, that's all fine. Oh, so maybe prior residency and then another one. So me skimming through it, it doesn't jump out to me exactly what the storyline is. And so it could be that I had PM was my second residency, my primary was neurology or psychiatry, something like that. That storyline doesn't jump out to me. And so maybe if I had read the very top, which I didn't do, maybe that explains it to me. You want to make sure that like someone understands the gist of you really early on. And so is it that, oh, see right here. So that was my fault. I didn't read the very first line, which is BC psychiatrist with 7 years clinical experience. So that was totally my fault, which is again, another reason why I like to have education up top. It just like totally solidifies because your identity is really being a doctor. It just really solidifies that up top. I like the use of percentages. It's really important in there. So just make sure your core qualifications don't overlap with your professional experience, meaning you've mentioned in professional experience, but you're also going to mention again core qualifications, excuse me. Way too much redundancy. So think about collapsing that down a little bit as well. But otherwise, really good one as well. And we'll get to the last one. Again, so we'll do this last one here in a couple of minutes. If you have final wrap-up questions, feel free to drop it in there. Okay, so education up top. I will make one comment for this resume. 6 pages is long. This is a CV clearly and not a resume. So if you're applying for a corporate medical role, for example, this resume is too long for the purposes of a corporate resume, unless the corporate resume is clearly in a research field, a CRO, things like that. But let's just say you're applying for a corporate medical director at a health insurance or a media company, things like that. That's too long of it. The other thing is that the after your name, you have a bunch of additional certifications, which are fantastic. It might be a little too many in there, so I would keep it brief to a couple different things, like your MD and MPH or TROPMed, whichever one you're kind of the most the highest one, for example. So MD and MPH are going to be pretty good for you. Clearly, you can keep the fellow in there, but from an industry perspective, if a non-clinical person is looking at it, they won't actually know what a fellow of whatever is typically. That way, just kind of your name is just more centered and it looks better. You did all the fellowships, a lot of training, clearly a lot of training there, and then your full-time work experience. Let's go to the next couple of pages. This is where you're just listing what you've done, and the resumes that really stand out don't just list what they've done. They've articulated what you've accomplished, right? So I see full spectrum, of all age groups. That's great. Is there a one level deeper in there in terms of that one in, is there a particular setting that you see them in that's really unique? Is it a volume thing that you do that made it really unique? Did you create any policies and things like that rather than just listing stuff? And the text is pretty dense. And I don't want to sound overcritical. You have a lot of accomplishments. I want to be really clear about that one. Way more accomplishments, certainly, I have. But if I'm reading it as a reviewer, it's a lot of work to go through half of that page and the next one to tease out for me as a skimmer your accomplishments. So if you can help me bridge those things, you're going to really stand out. Because right now I got to read through all the timeline and I got to read through those 2-line text for every year that you have in there. You're making the reviewer, who may not be a clinician, go through a lot of work to tease out what the key highlights are. And then on your professional certifications, again, for industry jobs, I would find a way to collapse them down or only leave the highlights: state board, your board certifications, other things that are really pertinent to the role, and the other stuff, leave on like your master document that you can pick and choose from depending on that one. Clinical research and publications, again, from an industry perspective, like that means non-research job, non-government job, things like that. All the other stuff you have in there with volunteer experience and things like that, I would be very selective because you have a real estate problem right now, which is you have 6 pages of it. I will not get to your 4th page if I'm screening the interview, unfortunately. And you have a lot of accomplishments in there, so you want to condense down the highlights of them so that visual looks really clear and to the point. Your problem will be you have so much experience. How do you select those in there? You'll have to fiddle around with different versions of it to make it look great, but clearly you have a tremendous experience. Okay, so I want to thank the 3 submitters. I know it took a lot of guts to do that, and for educational purposes, hopefully you guys got a little bit out of that. And if you're a viewer, it takes no small amount of courage to do that. And I want to really thank you guys for that. So we have any final questions, and we can kind of wrap up, I guess.
Sure. I see there's a question for me.
Oh, yeah.
And it says, for those of us who are interested in government positions, could you briefly list the essential components? I've heard it's recommended to list your FTE for each of your professional experiences. What I will say is there's probably not enough time to go into the depths of the differences between the government and the ones that are more for, corporations, businesses, and things like that right now. But perhaps in a follow-up session, we can talk a little bit more about how government positions differ. But I will say that they do differ. Like even going through that, there is a little bit more focus on the longer CV than perhaps the resume. They do definitely want the dates. They do definitely want the timeline. The FTEs, depending on which organization, whether it's national, state level, or local. The locals typically have a little bit more flexibility in terms of the format of the CVs, but as you're going to state or federal, then it becomes a little bit more rigid in terms of what they're looking for. So I guess the quick tip, as I know that we're already over time, is either to ask somebody who works for that organization to see their CV so you can get an idea, or type in something like CDC, resume, and then you can sort of see what those look like, because they are quite specific in how they want the role, they want the FTE, they want your level like that you were working at if you had been working in federal service prior. So it's a whole different realm, I guess, than industry, which is a beautiful thing about all the different kinds of options that people out of preventive medicine have. And I see there's a question about how you can get access to this webinar afterwards. So it will be recorded and it will be sent out through ACPM in order for you to access it again. I would like to extend a big thanks to Dr. Tzeng for all of his insights, particularly for industry, which is a difficult area for people to get into and may not be one that there's as much guidance in residency training. So this is really a unique opportunity for all of us to learn a little bit more about what positions in industry are looking for, both in terms of general tips for interviews, as well as more specifics for resumes that, 2-pager and trying to keep it brief and readable. So thank you so much. We appreciate all those that attended. There is a survey link in the chat. Please feel free to fill out that survey to give us feedback. I think there might be a couple of other just final slides, but just sharing that we have ACPM career resources on the ACPM website that you can find. Oh, here we go. So ACPM resources to expand your network. So you can find those on the website. There's also continuous improvement efforts on the career website where jobs are posted to try and get those to be more and more in line with preventive medicine positions. And more work is being done to build up the career resources for residents, for mid-career preventive medicine specialists, and all the way through the spectrum. One thing that we did want to point out is that there on the website you can find the career pathways in preventive medicine graphic, which helps to provide information about the different skills that preventive medicine physicians have to help in advocating for why you have a good fit for some of these positions that may not have ever heard of a preventive medicine physician before. So please feel free to take a look at those toolkits on the website. Again, you can email ACPM if you have any further questions, and feel free to connect with myself, Dr. Tzeng, on LinkedIn if you would like to be in touch with us. This is the email for ACPM, membership@acpm.org, and we look forward to connecting with all of you at a later date.
Thank you all. Good luck.
Thank you.